Powered by Sports Interaction, Canada Sportsbook.
What can you say about the Montreal Canadiens these last few games? I think what is most obvious is that this is a team who, after this latest wave of injuries in an endless sea of them the last two seasons, has gotten to the point that they're no longer competitive in the NHL. They don't have it. They're the guys who are still there playing, too tired. The guys that are called up from the American Hockey League gotten to a point now where they're just not ready. And frankly, as much as the Canadiens got a couple of decent chances tonight against the Red Wings, I don't think the blame lies on Caden Primo tonight. But having an NHL goaltender to stop a few shots doesn't hurt, as we saw with Detroit and Ville Husso. Not much to take out of these last few games for the Montreal Canadiens, except for maybe a stark reminder that they're not close, right? Obviously, lots of players missing, but lots of work to do. All right, we have a great guest tonight. Shane Malloy is going to come on. We're going to talk about some of the big conversations that we had last year when Shane was on the show about what the Canadiens can do to rebuild, how fast they can do it, all that and more. But first, it's time to talk about sports interaction. Whether you're betting NHL, NBA, or MLB, there's lots to talk about with sports interaction, lots of options to max out your betting. Play Pinata Picks or Minute Madness, exclusive games with insane odds that you can't play anywhere else. Make your next bet with Sports Interaction. Download the app in Ontario using the QR code you see at the bottom of the screen right now, or head to sportsinteraction.com/SDPN to get started. 19 plus, please play responsibly. All right, folks, I know that it's not the hype good vibes stream that we usually have, but let's have some fun. Let's welcome in Shane Malloy. Shane, how are you, my friend?
Doing very well. And, of course, it wasn't the game that we were hoping for, but there's always something to be learned. And I think the biggest reminder is the real importance of puck support. I think that was like the number one key I took away from the Habs tonight is where was your puck support? Every time, whether they had the puck or they didn't have the puck, they were so spread out. They either allowed Detroit to converge on the puck carrier by himself, where there's very little options within like a 5 foot or 6 foot range, or, the opposite, where they just got outmanned in defensively and in the neutral zone. And some of that certainly comes to not necessarily inexperience, but when you have younger players coming up from the American League, if you don't get to see the American League a lot, yes, it's the second best league in the world, but it's a little bit more chaotic and players aren't always where they're supposed to be. Where in the NHL, they're almost always where they're supposed to be for the most part. And that's why it's really hard to produce points in this league. But when you have younger players and they're trying to figure out what they need to do in terms of playing the system and chemistry, that there's too much thinking and not enough just instant reaction. And then when you have that, there's going to be these breakdowns. And it's not for lack of trying, and it's not for a lack of hockey sense, and it's not for a lack of skill. It's just that's simply just what happens when you have a lot of change in personnel on a roster and a lot of changes in line mates and unfamiliarity, and you're forced to think. And when players think on the ice, you don't want that. So, and it seemed to be that everything that, Montreal did ended up in the back of their net. It was one of those games where I just kind of I was watching the game and I kind of went, oh, there it is again. There it is again. Right. And you just sort of you can see it coming, 2 plays ahead. Oh, in the net. Right. Yeah. And you're just kind of okay, that's where the assistant coaches go back to the drawing board and goes, okay, just don't worry about what happened, but let's just let's tighten some things up. And that's really what I thought this game was in a nutshell.
Yeah, it really was. It was it was pretty predictable down. I think when you saw the way the previous two games went in terms of continually lacking that puck support and getting out-muscled for pucks continually, the way that the Canadiens have had trouble breaking off the wall, when you saw those same issues at the start of the period against a team like Detroit, which, no offense to Detroit, They are not a Carolina Hurricanes team. They're not a Florida Panthers team. They're much closer in terms of like their actual performance to the Canadiens than either of those teams. Even if they took a step this year, it looked like it was going to be a long game, and it felt like a long game, very long game for Caden Primo. I feel like he was kind of unfairly trashed online tonight, just following my Twitter feed. I don't think many of those goals you can really hang on Caden Primo, but at the same time, I saw an issue with Primo that has kind of dogged him every time that he's come to the NHL, and that's like he goes to make a save, and it's almost like he's making it with his eyes closed, because he like moves his glove like he's gonna catch it, and then it hits him in the pad, and he's like waving at pucks that aren't there, right, or that are gone wide. It seems like he doesn't know where the shots are gonna go, and it continually, I think he just seems like he's not quite gonna get there. He's probably a good AHL goaltender.
And that's okay.
Yeah,
That's okay.
seventh round pick.
Hey, look, if your 7th-round pick is your number one goalie in the American League, I know people may be screaming at the screen, but that's actually a home run. The probability of a 7th-round pick even playing any games at the NHL is single-digit percentile. So that's a home run. So if he can come up as like in an emergency as a backup as the number 3, and that's his career, great. And it could get better because, as we talked about a year ago, what were the Montreal Canadiens needed to do? The focus really was on player development, and not just at the AHL level, but at the prospect level, and then at the NHL level as well, because you need to continue to develop. I laugh when people say, "Oh, it's like, they should already play." No, you need constant improvement throughout the year. And that's actually one of the things I really liked about Montreal, is that they destroyed that notion that no, there's always time for skill development. There's always time for skating development within the season. You just make it happen inside of your practices, or instead of practices, for that matter.
Yeah, no kidding. Andrew DH98 says, "Can we blame Primetime Primo for his yo-yo treatment?" No, that's the thing. Like, I don't know if we talked about it too much on the show before. I know Mark Dumas has talked about it before because he's done interviews with Primo and worked with the Laval Rocket when he was with the Athletic, interviewing guys down there. But Caden Primo, like we mentioned before, was a 7th-round pick. He didn't have high expectations coming out of the draft. Then he had an amazing first year in the NCAA, and the Canadiens kind of convinced him that within a couple of years he'd be backing up Carey Price if he went and joined the American Hockey League team for them. And it's just been like up, down, all over the place, and he hasn't really developed any consistency. He had a great playoffs last year, but for the most part, he hasn't even had that consistency in the American Hockey League. The development up to this year probably hasn't helped Primo much at all. So he's only 23.
Right, and that's still young, very young. I know people have talked about this aging curve that's been, floating around the analytic community for quite some time, but none of that is based on science. None of it. Like, that whole notion is flawed. Like, the human brain does not develop that way. You are not in your prime years at age 21 and 22. No male is. We are primarily hairless monkeys for the most part. Like, the frontal lobe of our brain doesn't develop until you're about 24. So prior to that, we're consistently inconsistent as human beings, primarily males more than females in that respect. It's why car insurance companies drop their rates at 25. It's not a fluke. It's like based on science. So that's why I always say that draft +5, that draft +7, it's in that range. I mean, and it was a model that I ended up building back in 2007, and it was based on behavioral economics and cognitive performance and cognitive brain development. And that's why it wasn't like guessing. I just ended up talking to really super smart people that what they said made a lot of sense. So that's how I built that model around. And then people glommed onto it, but not knowing what it really meant. And then when I hear these aging models, I'm like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, it's not backed up by anything other than your production at that time in your age. But look at all the young players. When they're 2021, who do they play against? Do they play against the top pairing? No.
Yeah.
Do they play against the top lines? No. What about like on the road, especially? No, they're insulated. They're playing against third pairing, third lines, some second lines, and they're producing points, and everybody's like all excited. I'm like, well, okay, wait till they play against first pairing D on the road or first line on the road. What happens then? And then everybody says, oh, they've regressed. I'm like, no, they're against a much stiffer, better competition who can take away time and space. And you have problems creating time and space. So that's where some of the patience also has to come in for these young Montreal players. There's a lot of youth here. And I know there's a lot of excitement, but this is where it's easy to collect it. Now you have to develop it, and now you have to be patient with it. And I really think that's this. Now they're in the second stage. Last year, they were all about, okay, what do we have in a cupboard? How much more can we accumulate? Who are we going to sign? Now it's like, okay, now that we have it, what do we do with it? Now we have to be patient. Now it's going to take, there's going to be a 2-year grace period where these guys are going to have to learn, like, and take developmental steps. And just because they're 21 and 22, don't assume that they're going to be ready. Because if you look at history, they're not, especially defensemen, because there's no leeway for mistakes for D-men. Like yes, goaltending is like an island of itself, but young defensemen, that's the hardest job in hockey. It's incredibly difficult because half the time you end up skating backwards and having to make these decisions that are in front of you at the speed. I play D. But trust me, there's a reason why I'm talking to you, right? It's because that's how challenging it was. So that's where I'm really intrigued by what happens next with the Montreal in terms of the decisions that they make in their hockey operations department with these young players and how many of them actually you're going to see full-time in the American League, even though they did get, significant time at the end of this season and cups of coffee for the the players that were college players that were signed and came into the lineup.
Well, you mentioned patience, and I think that's going to be especially important to I think the coaching staff has that. I think they've shown that already. Obviously, I think management takes a very pragmatic look at things, but for fans, I feel like that patience is going to need to be on display next year, because those players that we're talking about who are 20, 21, 22 years old, especially on defense, in a normal situation, they are insulated, as you said. But because they're in the
American League.
Yeah, right. And
plain and simple, they're in the American League. They're not even in the NHL.
Right. And because of the team being so thin overall and the injuries that they've sustained over the last 2 years, there has been no insulation for those players. Like Caden Gooley got dropped into the NHL this year at 20 years old. Congratulations, kid. You're playing with David Savard on the first pairing against top competition every night.
Yeah.
And you see like analytics guys being like, well, his expected goals ratio is terrible. No kidding.
Like, have you ever played defense in your life? This is the one of the things, like, look, I use analytics and statistics every day for my job at EA. Every day. It's a really valuable tool. But unless you've been in the rink and you watch these players, particularly at a young age, but all the way through, you don't quite really, truly understand the context and the nuance of what that really means. And so anybody can stare at a spreadsheet or a bunch of numbers and start spewing out like commentary on social media. It's easy to do, but I spent 1,800 to 2,000 live games scouting. And I sat in the corner rink. I actually never sat with the media. When I go to junior games, American League games, college games in Europe, I always sit in the corner with the rest of the scouts, because that's where that's where I learn. Because I got to talk. That's where I learn. I talk to those guys. Even at the NHL level, when I had press credentials, I always asked the PR staff to put me beside the pro scouts. So it'd be all the line of the pro scouts, and then there's me, because then I get to ask questions, because that's where you understand the context and the nuance. And particularly when it comes to defensemen in that respect. So I think when this season's over for the Montreal Canadiens, there's going to be a big breath of air. Let it out. Let's evaluate what we have. There's going to be a lot of competition in camp. And there may be guys who played some significant games this year that end up going back and playing a year in the American League, and that's actually okay. It's actually better for them. I'd rather see a 21-year-old defenseman go back and play 20 minutes plus in the American League, first unit power plays or second unit power plays, last minutes of games, penalty kill, because you got to get the repetitions in, and it's a league that you can experiment in and make mistakes without it being catastrophic errors at the NHL level, because there's not enough recovery time for that. And that's why I think that's really, really critical for the Montreal Canadiens. And based on, everything when I've had conversations with Kent Hughes, when I've had conversations with people with the Montreal Canadiens, with their pro scouts or, members of their staff, they all seem collectively with the same message, is like, we're going to be patient, we're going to work with them, and we're looking at this long term.
Yeah.
And what I think is going to be like, and you had mentioned, I thought it was a really good point about the fans being, might be a little impatient because they've seen these guys play, and then why aren't they playing this year? Why aren't they progressing better? Because it's a really long road. I think it just has to be collectively across the board with all their staff, same messaging. And when you keep doing that, doesn't matter what the results are, especially for the first 40 games, 60 games of the season, then like the fans start to go, oh, well, everybody's saying the same message. Doesn't matter. Whole organization, obviously this is what it is. So that you don't have that mixed messaging of like, a guy's playing good, or like, of course, the players and their teammates are always going to pump everybody's tires. They're always going to do that. They're never going to throw each other under the bus. So you kind of have to ignore that, honestly, and then listen to what everybody else in the organization says. Because I've been in the locker room with the guys, and of course, behind the scenes, they'll say, yeah, he's a rook and he's going to make some mistakes in here. And then they'll talk more candidly, but in front of a camera or they're being quoted, they're always going to pump tires. And that's okay, right? So they should. But it's just for the fans out there, hey man, I've been a fan too. Is just almost ignore that and just listen to the messaging. And I think so. One refreshing thing I like about Kent Hughes is his messaging is always consistent, and that seems to be consistent amongst the entire staff. He just says, "This is what the message is. We stick to it."
The consistent messaging and the transparency of that message and the plan, I think, is the big factor.
They've given you a little bit, like pull the curtain back, and they've given you enough to say, they've done some videos and stuff. I know with Matt Nickel down in Laval, and just, showing some stuff and conversations with players, and what it's given the fans is enough to say, oh, there is an actual logical, like well thought out strategic plan for every individual player inside of a collective organization, because everybody learns and adapts and progresses at different rates. Everybody does. So I think from a fan base standpoint, that's refreshing. And you go, okay, we don't know the entire strategy and the plans and the tactics, but we know that it's at least well thought out, and that they are following through, and there's constant communication, and there's constant help and assistance to the players to get better and for them to get better from that standpoint. And I think they did a really good job at the draft as well, as opening up the door a little bit and filming some of the conversations they've had around that. So adding Chris Boucher into the mix and then having that on film as well. So it shows more of a well-rounded approach, similar to what we talked about. Like the Montreal Canadiens are a Fortune 500 company, and Kent Hughes essentially is a CEO of an operations department of a Fortune 500 company. So he should act as that. And his assistant GMs and everybody in the director positions are in formative positions of a Fortune 500 company. So you want to be able to hear some of that interaction with each other and logical, rational decision-making processes, not just, like basically irrational, bonded irrationality, because this is what happened before. So let's just do it and see what happens. And it's just, to me, it's just like, I like it because I'm a business guy. I'm an entrepreneur. So when I see those things in hockey, I'm like, yes, right. It doesn't always work out the way you plan. Like things go awry, but at least there's progression. At least you can go back and go, okay, what happened here? And backcast and try to figure out, okay, what were the pitfalls? What did we miss? Was it us, or is it just simply, there is some luck involved in this game, especially when it comes to injuries in that respect. So to me, if I look at it from an outsider, I'm not a Montreal fan. I don't get to cover the team on a regular basis other from more of a national level. But I think it's the first time in over a decade, well over a decade, maybe 15 years, maybe back as far as 2005, where I really thought, oh, this organization is moving in the right direction in terms of just management. And I have a bit of a different philosophy when I look at strengths of organizations. I actually don't immediately look at the players. That's secondary to me. I actually look at the hockey operations department and the owner. I look at the owner and hockey operations. I'm like, okay, who's there? Who's making decisions? How do they make decisions? They as long as a group is together for a little while, they leave breadcrumbs for their decisions. You start to figure out how they make decisions and why, and so you start to see, oh, okay, wait a minute. Based on what they've done, there is, a pattern of behavior, and it's proven out that they make sound, rational decisions. It always doesn't work, but they incrementally are going to get better. So to me, if I'm a Montreal fan, I'm really happy with the progress that this group has made. It's early on, but to me, it just seems like there's steady hands on the wheel of the Montreal Canadiens, and we haven't, you guys haven't been able to say that for, I don't know, 15
Long
years.
While. It's been a while. I mean,
Yeah.
I feel like there was times during the Bergevin tenure where there was a possibility of the team becoming something more than what it was, and then, like something happened to trigger an emotional response, and then the direction was changed, or a player who was a big piece of the team was all of a sudden no longer within like the favorites group of the general manager and was moved out, all that sort of stuff. But
Well,
I do want to seize on one thing that you said. But before I do, I want to tell everyone who's enjoying the stream right now, don't forget to like the stream because it helps the YouTube algorithm suggest us to other Canadiens fans and helps more people find this stream, and then we can have more fun the more people are here. But you mentioned something, Shane, about when you have good processes and you're looking at things in a way that should breed success, even when there are pitfalls and mistakes, you can go back and figure out what led to those. I mean, like you said, sometimes there's just bad luck. One of the things that I've seen fans of the show be a little bit concerned about this year is specifically the Canadiens, like the rumors surrounding the Canadiens' upcoming draft position, right? And obviously these are rumors. Some of it's like reported as preferences. The Canadiens are looking to add size this year because they've got a fair amount of small players. I think balance is good, but the worry that a lot of people have is that the Canadiens might pass on a guy like, say, Matvei Michkov at between like 5 and 7 if he falls, for somebody who would be a bit of a reach because they're a large player. I look back at last year's draft and I say, look at what they did with that draft, and I think that we can give them like a little bit of credit, right? But
Messar,
yeah, exactly.
Lane Hutson. Like
yeah,
I
a lot
saw
of those
Lane
players
Hutson
are small.
not long ago. I was in Boston and saw him not long ago. Messer as well. So I don't think that's a concern.
No,
The advantage that the Montreal Canadiens have as well is it's an organization that has a tremendous amount of prestige and legacy, and that's attractive to players, especially players that are going to be drafted by them. Like, I even remember when we have players at the draft, because we do the live show right beside the stage, and they just can't believe they were drafted by the Montreal Canadiens, and that has value in that as well.
Sure.
And you can hear things that in the media. Look, I work in the prospect realm. This is like our 18th year on air on NHL Network Radio, and I dismiss a lot of it because I get to sit with the scouts and I hear what's going on. That's not if I was a Montreal fan, don't worry about that. If Matej Michkov is on the board and Montreal's sitting there at 7, they're taking Mitchkov. And if they got to wait 3 years, they don't care. And no one else should care either. And look, the kid's gone through a tremendous amount of tragedy in the last 48 hours. Obviously, condolences to him and to his entire family. Nobody at that age should ever lose a parent. And obviously, all the NHL teams are going to be looking at that, very closely. But the kid is so incredibly talented. Like, in terms of pure talent, he's the second best player in the draft board in terms of just talent alone. But obviously, when you get Adam Fantilli, obviously a big, strong centerman who's exceptionally talented as well. Like Lucas Carlson is in that mix as well. A guy who can play center and wing. It really depends on where Montreal falls. It doesn't really matter. Like, if they're in the top 5, don't worry about who you take. They're all excellent players. You could take Wilson, you could take Smith. It's all good. Like, you're going to find players throughout this draft class. And the Montreal Canadiens have so many young prospects that the next wave coming in, like this year and next year and the year after that, they're going to be given the time because there's so many players in front of them to try to fight for actual roster spots. By the time, those players are ready to come through, there might be opportunities. So the most important thing the Montreal Canadiens are building for themselves right now is time. Time is their greatest asset as an organization. So if you have that many prospects, let them develop, let them, like, basically it should be like Mad Max Thunderdome, like 2-man enter, 1-man leave. Internal competition is great for prospects. Like, let them battle it out. And then whomever the players that you don't deem as valued, obviously you don't make it public, but those are the players that you're going to package up. And you have another wave coming behind that. So for me, in this draft class, we'll see what happens when the ball bounces in that lottery. Maybe you get lucky. It wouldn't surprise me that a team like Montreal gets Bedard. It would just, him and Suzuki would be a nightmare to play against.
Well, and you got Doc on the third line too.
Right. And then at that point, you have to really figure out what you're going to do because Doc shouldn't be playing on a third line. Really, that's really like Jordan Staal in Pittsburgh, and he just really shouldn't be there. And that's where you say, "Hey, Kirby, you want to go play on the wing with Connor Bedard?" And he's like, "Sure."
No.
Because I don't want to score 35 goals a year, right? With this guy set, because everybody's going to be drawn to him, and you're going to create time and space for me as a 6'3" forward. I just I think there's a lot of upside, particularly with Montreal. It's going to take some time. There's going to be some growth steps. They remind me a lot of what happened in New Jersey in the steps they took. Yeah. And, they kind of broke out this year. And Buffalo's going to be like New Jersey. They're going to break out. And Montreal's
Buffalo looks scary.
Right? And they're going to be a year away. Like next year, they're probably busting through and somebody's falling out of that East. And then Montreal's a couple years behind that. And I think a lot of things, you made another good point about when you're talking about the era when Marc Bergevin was there and some of the inconsistencies or change in directions that seem to happen. One of the things that happens in an organization is when you have a great goaltender like Carey Price, is that he covers up for a lot of your mistakes. The same thing happened in New Jersey with Martin Brodeur. Like, the New Jersey Devils and the Montreal Canadiens drafting records in the salary cap era from 06 to 15 was abysmal. Montreal was awful. They were second last. New Jersey was in the bottom 5. And although those organizations were still successful, is because your goaltender masked a tremendous amount of mistakes. And now when you take that player out, look what happened in New Jersey when Brodeur was no longer there. The whole box caved in. It was like a wet cardboard box. Same thing happened with Montreal. When Carey Price isn't there to make up for it, all of a sudden it all collapsed. And you really started to see what the organization was really built on. It's built on this elite level goaltender who could no longer be elite. Yeah. And that's what happens. Like, you can cover up bad drafting and you can cover up bad player development and you can cover up some bad free agency with a great goalie. And when you don't have it, it just amplifies every decision you make. And now, I think everybody realized what was really going on behind the scenes in terms of an organization once Carey Price couldn't play anymore.
Yeah, it became an ugly situation pretty quickly. One thing that has also been a topic of conversation that I think you are uniquely qualified to talk about is specifically some worry about the Canadiens drafting going forward, specifically Nick Bobrov. And I know you're someone who holds Bobrov in very high esteem. I believe on the show last year you said he was like one of the
He's very
smartest people
smart.
in hockey.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people look at the draft record when he was with the Rangers, and obviously not too spectacular. Some fumbled. I don't know if I would say fumbled, but maybe the development track hasn't been great in New York
But
for guys
and
like
that has nothing to
Capo
do with
Caco.
evaluation.
Right.
Evaluation is one part, development's another. And that
So
was an
yeah,
argument. I've had an argument about that specifically. It's funny you brought that up. And I was arguing with somebody in the New York Rangers organization, and he thought that it was more evaluation based. And I said, no, I think it's more development based. And we kind of went at it a little bit, not in a mean way, but we had a really spirited like conversation. And I go, look, I have the data to like this, what's going on. Like when you have 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 players that have stumbled in their development, and I'm not like saying you take the ridiculous expectations that are out in the public sphere, cut it to 80%, and that's what the player probably is gonna. It really should like expectations should be, but when they meet half of that, and it's more than half a dozen players, it's not the evaluation. It's going to be my attention is going to go to player development. So in terms of an evaluator, I'm not concerned about Nick being there. Like it's not just people that talk to me about him in New York, but was when he was in LA as well. And I know a lot of the people that work in the LA organization that hold him in high esteem because he's very, very smart and he works his ass off. Like that guy, I've seen a lot of scouts in the NHL that do not work hard at all.
right,
But
right.
Nick works his ass off and he's really smart, and he's very detailed. And look, also to make this really clear, like I've been very fortunate to like live in the scouts world. It is the hardest job in hockey. Like I'm in my PhD program and scouting's harder. Like, and I'm a reasonably intelligent person that can get through academics, and scouting is infinitely more difficult at the amateur level. You're trying to figure out a 17, 8-year-old kid into a 23-year-old man. It's like
Yeah,
basically you might as well go into the rink with a cardboard box in your head, and then like just write out some stuff, and then go to the next game with a cardboard box in your head because it's so difficult to figure that out. So I think from my standpoint, when you talk about Marty Lapointe and Nick Bobrov and Nick, I'm not concerned about them. It's also the advantage that Nick has because he's running the staff is he's so detail oriented that he's very specific about what he wants from his scouts, and that he's very super organized as well. That they're going to be filing really strong reports. If not, he's going to be asking why. And he's a pretty good facilitator from my understanding. So he's going to ask really good questions, and he's going to like punch holes in arguments, not in a mean way, but you want to make sure that you have as much information as possible and that your information that you're discussing about that player is reasonable and rational and is backed up by data. And I mean, data is not just in terms of numbers, but data is just information. So that's not a concern from my standpoint.
yeah. I think where it comes from is I think people look at the trio of Lias Anderson, Vitaly Kravtsov, and Capo Caco all kind of failing to this point to live up to expectations. And then they see a rough first season from Uri Slavkovsky, and they're seeing like 4 European players. Bobrov's involved in the draft, and they connect these dots that maybe don't necessarily have anything to
Right.
do with each other whatsoever, and say, well, these guys are all busts, and we're going to declare this on Slavkovsky, despite the fact that he just turned 19 years old. He was like pretty young in his draft year, and
And you just hit the nail on the head. What's the common thing amongst all those players when they came to North America? They got thrown to the wolves really early, like 2 years faster than they really should have. And what was the issue in New York? Player development. Now, if you're a fan and you don't know any of that information, then your immediate you're just gonna look to the draft. But the problem is a guy's drafted, then what happens after that?
right.
So what's Kraftstoff's connection to the New York Rangers staff when he's playing in Russia? And how are they assisting him in his player development? And how are they working in conjunction with his team in Russia? What's the same thing happen with Elias Anderson? Are they communicating properly with him? Do they understand how he learns? Like, like the player development staff, the players don't adapt to them. You have to adapt to the players.
Yeah.
Because the players are the student. You're a teacher. You adapt to your student. So how do they learn? How do they absorb information? What are their needs? And if you're just looking at them like a carbon copy player and you're using I'm not saying everything old school is bad because it's not. But if you don't have a specific plan. And that's the advantage like I have on my show is I bring in guests who have worked with all types of NHL players in the player development sphere, and they're so detailed in their plans specifically that when you don't see that in NHL organizations, you go, oh, that's why things aren't working out. And it's not necessarily the evaluation. Now, sometimes it is, because there is the skill component of what happens on the ice, and then there's emotional and mental attributes. And sometimes we do a very poor job in hockey of measuring and understanding where the strengths and weaknesses lie in your mental and emotional attributes. All of us have different strengths and weaknesses, and some of them are more valuable to play in the NHL than others. And how do you not only you evaluate that, then how do you weight that properly? And then once you know that, how do you help that player? Do you have people on staff to help them get better? Do you have mental coaches that help them with a specific plan from age 18 towards they get to the NHL? And if you leave a kid like that on his own and you just tell him the regular bullshit of, oh, be a good teammate and stay out of the bars and don't drink too much. You have problems with your girlfriend, call me. That's not player development. That's not human development. That's not going to get your guy to the NHL. You're basically hoping, and hope's not a plan. And that's sort of the difference that I've seen behind the curtains of some organizations that are really successful and ones that are not. So I look at teams like the Washington Capitals or the LA Kings or the Anaheim Ducks. Now, the Ducks are not good, but I think that's mostly pushed upon them because of bad asset management. But their drafting development was incredible.
Oh,
like currently the Anaheim Ducks have 11 defensemen that they've drafted and developed that are in the NHL. 11.
And like all of them are top 4.
Or at least top 5.
Yeah.
Right? But it's crazy. So
look what Brandon Montour's doing this year in Florida.
Yeah, and who drafted
him? What the heck? Yeah.
Yeah, Martin Madden, who was a candidate to be a GM. Now I'm fine. Like it's fine that the person they chose for Montreal is very good, but I know people were talking about Martin Madden. He can only do one of these one thing and scout. I'm like, that's not true. He's exceptionally intelligent, has multiple degrees, but it's really about you look at organizations and like, oh, wait a minute, over a long period of time, what are they doing there from the evaluation standpoint and the player development department? And you just ask questions. And they always leave breadcrumbs of what they do. And you're like, oh, okay. Right. And they reveal some stuff, but not all the state secrets. But you can begin to piece things together. And I'm starting to see some very similar things from what Washington does and Anaheim's done and LA's done. Boston Bruins have done in terms of their player development. Look at Providence. They keep pumping players out. Why? What's going on there? Right. And so I start to see similar things that Montreal's been saying and what Montreal hockey operations has been doing. So from my perspective, if that keeps happening, then what they're doing is emulating these really successful franchises to give themselves a chance. Doesn't guarantee success, but if you can draft exceptionally well and develop exceptionally well, you give your organization a chance to be in the playoffs every year. Look at Washington. How many years were they in the playoffs? What, 15, 16
Yeah,
years in a row?
it's a long
Right?
stretch.
Like LA built up a Stanley Cup champion, tore it down a little bit, and rebuilt it. And they're one of the top 7 teams in the league again. They did that all in the salary cap era, right? So it can be done. So I'm starting to see some of those similar things in Montreal, which gives me reason to think that they're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and to put a bow on this whole topic, I'll go back to what you said earlier about having good process and looking back and maybe learning from mistakes. I'll loop in Jeff Gorton, who was in charge in New York when Bobrov was there as well. Obviously, the two worked together very well. And maybe, despite the fact that I think at this point, based on like results-based analysis, we could all say maybe Slavkovsky should have been in the American Hockey League this year. But if he looked at what happened in New York with all those top picks that didn't pan out, that got traded, or I think Kako is starting to pan out a little bit better now, but maybe more as like a defensive guy than offensive guy. But then you look at what New York was doing with development, and the Canadiens hired Adam Nicholas, right?
Yeah.
So now you've got Bobrov still there, so that piece is still there, but you've added something different once that pick is made.
Well,
You've got a different situation than what you had in New York. So it's not doomed
it's
to
not
be
a
the
carbon
exact same
copy
thing.
of the same.
Exactly.
One of the things they did, what they did was, is what's going to be best for Slavkovsky? Like, do we bring him in here with all these resources so we can monitor him every day? Now, if it was me, I would have had him in the American League the entire time. But I'm
Same.
conservative when it comes to prospects. I will always go on the urge caution when it comes to that. So I would have had him in the American League the whole time and gave him some sniffs when he had really earned it. Had a great week, up for a game, then back down again. Because I just wanted to put him I want to see him in a position where he plays in every situation and is the man in the American League. Just go into the American League and be the man. But then you can monitor all that within close confines. So he's not like living in, say, like Hartford, if he was with the Rangers by himself in his own condo, and you don't know what he's up to, really, right? Where, like Montreal and Laval, it's here. Like he can't escape it. From that standpoint, he can't escape the Montreal Canadiens hockey operations department. Like, it's going to be a daily routine to build up his habits. And that's really what it is to build his habits up so that everything he does on and off the ice is going to help him succeed. So it's just, and monitoring that and remembering he's 18, 19 years of age. He's a kid in some respects, right? Even though he looks like a monster, and yes, he says all the right things. What were we like when we were 18 and 19?
Dumb.
I should not have been in that position. I can tell you that, especially with that paycheck. So, I understand their reasoning and their strategy around bringing him in. I just would have been probably a little bit more conservative than them, but that's just my personal preference.
Yeah, and I think they've been pretty clear all season that like the reasoning was get him working with Adam Nicholas every day, basically working on what he needs to translate from
and
Europe
all the other
to the
development
NHL.
coaches. Yeah. And there's, and their strength and conditioning coaches, as
Mhm.
well as, their mental coaches, and the coaching staff in the American Hockey League. And then when he does come up, gets to work with that coaching staff, and they're all like working in conjunction. What I also like is, one of the things that Kent Hughes had said right away, which I really liked, is eliminating silos so that there is this communication flow all to one player profile so that everybody contributes to it, but everybody reads it. And then they have discussions about, okay, how does this all integrate? Because that's the hardest thing, is integration. It's exceptionally hard to figure out how that all pieces together and what's most valuable. So it's just, it's also like you can't control everything a human being does. He's still he's still his own person, and he's going to make his own decisions. and that will impact his success as well. But I mean, it's a hell of a lot better than what had transpired in the past. I'm not saying anything mean about those individuals. I happen to really like them personally, but I didn't see anything in their operations that gave me any hope or indication that it seemed kind of almost by the seat, making decisions by the seat of their pants.
Yeah.
Mostly what I found, it was really, they're making a lot of decisions based on intuition, based on experience and intuition. And now sometimes in really critical situations, depending what field you're in, it's a valuable tool. But I found in hockey, if you're a player, intuition's helpful. If you're a coach and the game is on the line and the game is flowing, intuition experience in that situation would matter. But as a management, I don't like, you have to be very wary of using intuition and experience sometimes in your decision making, because experience can blind you, right? I could say, well, I know more about scouting than you do because I've scouted, 1,800 to 2,000 live games. But if I just relied on my experience, what I'm doing is I'm putting blinders on,
Yep.
and I'm making these assumptions and big assumptions, and I'm pushing all my eggs into a basket of certainty. I'm certain this is because I've seen it before. And certainty is the most dangerous aspect of decision making. What you're most certain of is the ones that's when things blow up in your face. And that's where I think maybe the Achilles heel was of the previous regime, and that caught them, is they could have used some balance inside of that operations department, where you can have guys that are more intuitive based decision makers, but you needed some guys who are more like Spock, live long and prosper. You need some people like with some logic and some reasoning.
100%. There's a comment here, talking about development. Trinka says, sometimes I wonder if Galchenyuk had a kinder development that actually encouraged
Yes.
him to loosen up and play his game what he could have been. I've talked about it a few times on the show, and I know some people are probably going to roll their eyes because I bring it up fairly often, but when Alex Galchenyuk had his rookie year at 18 years old, I think he turned 19 near the end of the year. I forget when his birthday is, but I think it's in May. Somebody can look that up if they want. But as a teenager, he had the highest points per 60 minutes the league had seen as a teen since Sidney Crosby. He was like way ahead of guys like Tyler Seguin, like everybody around his age group. He was way, way ahead. And yeah, he was playing third line minutes, not the same minutes that Crosby was playing with the Gallagher and Eller on that line. But when you have that level of production at 18 years old and it turns into barely an NHL player, something went massively wrong.
Well, I mean, you're a product of your environment. Too much too soon. Too much too soon. He should have been back in junior. His production was great on a third line against third pairing D and other third lines. He has enough hockey sense and puck skills to take advantage of those players for a while until they start figuring out his patterns. And that's where you need to be back in junior to be more experimental, and that's where organizations start building habits in players on and off the ice. And it's unfortunate because most players fail because of the product of the environment they're in. They don't want, like, you seen Galchenyuk when he was like in the OHL, he was great. He was great. Now, did he have some work to do on off the puck? Of course he did.
Yes.
They all do, right? Like, rarely do, like, I find a player that's similar to like a Peyton Krebs who's like more advanced off the puck. That's rare. But that's the problem, is you're throwing these kids into the deep end of the pool. Oh, here, by the way, have an anchor. Take that, splash. And then what happens is mentally and emotionally, they start to break down, because in human beings, we never rise to the challenge. We only fall to the level of our training. And this is a proven fact with any military organization in the world. When they do all their training for their special units, that's why they train up people so much, is because at a point where you're not thinking, you're just reacting, or there's so much duress and stress on you, you just fall to the level of your training. And if your training habits aren't good, you're going to fail. And it doesn't matter how talented you are, sooner or later, it's going to crumble on you. And that's the difference between, like, now you look at Sidney Crosby is an anomaly
Yeah.
because he was building these habits as a 16-year-old, right? What you would normally be building as a 22-year-old. He was he's an anomaly. He's a freak of nature in that respect. But 95% of the other prospects, regardless of where you're drafted in the first round, you all have to go back for multiple years. And it's okay. And I've been trying to break this narrative for the last 18 years on our show. I don't care if they were drafted in the first 5 picks. Go back to junior. Oh, but other guys did that. Yeah, and how did that work out? I hate that narrative that they have to play in the NHL because they did that 20 years ago. I don't care. Just because somebody made a bad decision 20 years ago doesn't mean I have to follow your dogma. Doesn't mean I have to follow your decisions. It's ridiculous. Like, every time I love Steve Cooley, but I fight with him on that. I don't care. Yeah, but this GM did it. I'm like, okay, he made a bad decision. What, I'm not allowed to say that he made a bad decision by putting an 8-year-old kid into the NHL? I'm going to say it. I don't care
And
because it's true.
Sebastian Jackson in the stream chat brings up, like, don't forget that Galchenyuk missed most of the previous season with a knee injury, right?
Yeah.
So, like, he played half that season because it was the lockout season in junior in Sarnia. It's wild, really, that they decided to pluck him out. I know he was 3rd overall, but the fact that he missed a year of development,
that makes the decision even worse.
It does,
right? Because this is a similar situation of what happened with Shane Wright. In that respect, he missed that whole year because of COVID and didn't play. And those games matter. Like, if you look at the successful players that are in the second round and later, is look at how many games played they had before they turned pro, whether they went through the college route or through the CHL. You get over a certain threshold and it makes the probability increase a lot to be successful, even to play between 50 and 150 games or 200 plus games. Those games played mattered. And you started to see that when he was in Seattle. And it was the best thing they could have done is just send him back to junior and let him dominate and see what happens in the playoffs with Windsor. Even though, like last time I checked, they were down 2-0, but maybe they storm back. But those are good experiences. The World Juniors is the best thing that could happen to him. Those are the things that needed to happen with Galchenyuk and other Habs prospects that were just thrown into the fire. I know everybody's all excited about Lane Hutson. I saw him play. I went down to Boston. I saw him play at BU. And he's so dynamic. He's so elusive. He's so small. Like, I was standing beside him, and I'm like,
small.
I'm like, oh my God. Like, I go, Lane. I'm like, we got to put some beef. And he goes, I'm trying. Right? He must be 5'9" because he's shorter than I am. And he's got to be 160 pounds soaking wet. And that doesn't mean he can't play, but I really think he needs to be a 3-year player in college. And I know everybody's going to be, if he puts up great points again next year and maybe he wins Hobie, like, don't care. Because he has to learn to defend at the NHL level.
And being in college is probably the best possible situation for him, right? Because he's got more downtime to be in the gym, to add layers of muscle. He doesn't quite
have the frame for it, though. He's got, I'm not kidding. He's got the frame of a skater kid. He's like, the poor guy's skinny, but you can get away with that. Like, if you look at defensemen that are smaller to defend well, I just go, he needs to watch game film of Jared Spurgeon every game.
Yep.
If you're going to defend in this league, you got to look at Grizzlick. You got to look at Jared Spurgeon. You have to actually stop the play before it hits the dots in the defensive zone. That's what he has to do. He's got to stop the play then. He can't have the play go below the dots, because that's when he's going to get in trouble. But then if it does, then he has to understand how to use leverage properly. He has to make sure his stick is perfect. His body position is perfect. That's what he's going to have to. He's got to break up plays early.
At the end of the day, he's going to have to be smarter than everybody else, right? In order to defend in his own zone, he's going to have to be smarter.
Well, he's got to break the play before it happens. You just, because what they're going to do is they're going to want to dump it in on him, and he's going to have to retrieve faster, and he's going to have to process faster. He has no choice because he can't get pinned. because
Would you believe that he's actually up 12 pounds since the draft? So you were saying he's 160 soaking wet. He was 148 when he was drafted.
150 probably, so he might be at 162. I mean, look, I'm standing beside him and I'm 5'10", but I'm also like an old man who's 200 pounds, right? So, that's a little different. When I'm looking, I'm like, oh my God, kid, I think I can like push you over with a stiff breeze. But when you watch him, you're just like you're godsmacked.
Yeah.
Like I got to see him twice when I was down in Boston, and I was just like, no wonder everybody excited. But then I'm always tempered because the minute I see him without the puck, I'm like, okay, now you see what he needs to really work on because he can get away with it because he's so dynamic from that standpoint. I'd like to like it's rare for small defensemen to make it. Do you know how many defensemen are 5'10" and smaller in the NHL? 10.
Not a
10.
lot. Yeah.
10, right? So what does that tell you? 10. Like that's about 5.25% of the league. It doesn't, I'm not saying he can't make it, but he's going to have to be very specific in his development to make it. And he's got to get on everybody's hands. If you're a small D-man, I was a smaller D-man, you got to get on their hands right away. I'm hoping for him because if the kid hits, boy, will he'll put up a lot of points on the power play. A lot of points.
That's the thing about him. I think that he is a guy that if he does make the NHL, he's going to be incredible. But he's got a big hurdle to get there.
Right. He's a specialist. So you're going to need somebody like Jack Eye to be with him.
Right.
But
I think Caden Gooley makes sense.
Caden Gooley might end up being better. And the reason why I say that is that Caden Gooley can put himself into better positions to take passes and to deal with his he's unpredictable, right? And you're going to have to be able to make up for range in those situations because he's going to do things that no one else thinks of or move the puck in places no one else thinks of. And when you have a player like that, you're almost got to lean a little bit over to the more of the middle of the ice because you never quite know what he's going to do. And you need somebody with a pretty high IQ to handle that too. The only concern is like Gooley's going to be out. Like, it depends on the progression of the other D in terms of their ability to defend. Because Gooley's going to end up having to defend a lot, and can Hutson handle that too? So you may have to insulate him with maybe Jack Eye on a third pair, but then he's a power play specialist and racks up 50, 60 points a year because he can dance around the offensive zone like a wizard. Like when he has the puck, he's a wizard. Like no one can touch him in college hockey. Now, my choice for the Hobey Baker, I'll let you guys know ahead of time, is Adam Fantilli because I haven't seen a freshman do that in, I don't know, forever. Like Paul Kariya.
Would be like Eichel? Or even before
no,
Eichel.
he's better than Eichel. He's better than Eichel as a freshman. Like maybe Paul Kariya. Like he's utterly dominant, not just offensively, but defensively too. And physically. Like the kid's a beast. Now, I think he should go back, but we'll see what happens. But, but Lane Hutson, is deserving of Hobey Baker. Like he really is. And if he goes back to college, he could easily win Hobey next year.
I mean, I feel like this year in the NCAA, there were a plethora of players who could have won a Hobey Baker in any other year. Like it seemed like there were some crazy performances this year. Like I think you could make an argument for Devin Levi. You could make an argument for Hutson. You could make an argument for Fantilli, for Logan Cooley. Like there have been some incredible performances in college hockey this year. Dina Zulu asks, where does Bedard fall, NHL or back to juniors? I think I would bet every red cent that I've ever earned in my life that he will be in the NHL next year.
I'd bet my house.
Yeah.
I'll bet my house and my college and my kid's college fund. He's going to the NHL. Now, everybody else, you should go back. Like Fantilli, like Lucas Carlson, everybody, just go back. Either go to college. I mean, the only one that really will probably push that will probably be Fantilli. I think Lucas Carlson will stay another year in Europe and Sweden. Mitchkov is under contract, so he's not going anywhere. But Fantilli could entice somebody to keep him because of his size and his combination of skating and his hockey sense. But I really like to see guys come in and dominate for 2 years before you move on. And there's no rush. Like, is it going to really move the needle of a team in the one of the second or third worst team in the league?
And if he could, do you want him to? Are you ready to take that next step?
That's a
Like, I
lot of
don't.
like that means you have to play in the top two lines and you're gonna have to be on the top power play. I mean, to really move the needle, and you're gonna put that on the back of like this 18-year-old kid. I'm just like, I just don't want I don't see that's a recipe for success. Like, unless you're a Crosby or a McDavid, okay. But everybody else, forget about it. Head on
Yeah,
back to junior, head on back to college, go back to your club team in Europe, and just get bigger, stronger, faster, smarter, more mature. Because the NHL is not a developmental league. You know, that's where people go to like survive or die. Like, it really is like Thunderdome in that respect. And one of the best things that I got to experience is when I'd go to practices at NHL games, I'd go watch the young guys who got called up in the prospects, guys from AHL, and then after practice, I go talk to the veterans because they'll tell you if he's ready. It'll be off the record. I'm like, so what'd you think? The kid hadn't even played a game, just a couple of days of practice, and they'll say, no, he's not ready. Just from his practice habits, he goes, he's got to go back. They know, right? And that's where we get some really valuable insight. And then you ask why. Okay, what about their game? And here they'll give you a couple like tidbits, and then you go watch the player play, and you go like, oh, yeah, wasn't they didn't even have to watch the kid play, and they knew, and then he had to go back. It just, we get all excited, and don't get me wrong, like I'm a fan too, of course, not as much a fan in hockey, but in other sports. So I get irrational. I'm a Cleveland Browns fan. Of course, I'm irrational, right? But that you have to kind of like hone that back in and go, it's tough because you want your team to win so badly, and you want the players to play right away.
right.
Um, but I think in the information age now, I think the fans are so much more sophisticated than they were 10 years ago. So I think yes, they know more, but there's a little bit more irrationality because they all get together on Twitter or social media and yell at each other. So there's that as well. But I think the Montreal fans have a lot to look forward to. I think I think they're going to be a really, really dangerous team in 3 years. In 3 years, I think they could end up being the New Jersey Devils in 3 years. But they got to
I
be
think
patient. They
I think
got
everyone
to
will be
let.
very pleased with that. One last question, then we'll close it out for tonight because I don't want it to keep you forever. But as the Canadians have once again gone through a season, well, yes, there's injuries, there's a lot, they're not a great team, blah 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 blah. But the special teams continue to be
Erratic.
horrendous. Uh, Erratic is kind. It's continually just awful, both PK and power play. The coaching staff seems to be set right now. I think the Canadians are very happy with. Geez, now I'm blanking on the name. The defensive coach used to play for the Leafs. He got put on Robida.
Yeah.
Uh, they're very happy with Robida, the way he deals with the players. They seem to really like Alex Burrows as well. Do you think this is because the Canadians have the Montreal Canadiens budget? Do you see them as a team who could be in a position where they hire like a special teams specialist coach?
I don't think necessarily they have to, because both those players killed penalties. Both those players at some point were on their power play, especially Burrows. So they understand that a large part of their inconsistency is a lot of lineup changes. So chemistry matters. And then changing tactics. So anytime you change tactics and strategy with the team, and I've talked to players who have had a different coach every year for 5 years in a row, and they go, it's madness because by the time you figure out a new system and a new one changes, like you have to get into a situation where you become autotelic, where you don't think about it anymore. And those players haven't quite got there yet. It really takes a full season and probably another half season where you have your collective group together with all these more of these younger players back in the American League, and then things will start to settle down. You'll start to see that, or you should see that settle down. So I wouldn't worry about that as much. I don't think it's an issue in terms of tactics or the coach's ability not to be able to coach it. I think it's really a byproduct of a new system, asking them to do new things. They haven't quite figured exactly out what they need to do in terms of chemistry, and then chaos in the roster because of injuries. And I can't emphasize, like, that's really critical, because if you and I are playing together and say we played together for a couple seasons and then I get a new defense partner, I don't know what the hell he's doing out there. Like, we're going to make a lot of mistakes because I'm used to knowing where you're going to be, right? And that matters because you don't have enough time to think. I know where you're going to be, and I'm going to move the puck there. So
For sure.
that's part of it as well. So I would lean to be more patient in that respect as well, because it really was a season of chaos when it comes to injuries and people coming in and out of the lineup.
Yeah, it's been a wild one, a wild couple seasons here. I mean, they had a lot of roster turnover before the injuries. So now you're compounding that. It's a lot. But thanks so much for doing this with me tonight, Shane. We only got 4 games left of this season. Saturday night, I should mention, if you check out the link in the YouTube description or in the podcast description, there is a link there to buy tickets to a live event that we're hosting with Habs Eyes on the Prize and Habs Fan TV at La Cage by the Bell Center. It's going to be really fun. We have some swag to give out from our sponsors, Sports Interaction. We've got some prizes to give out that we're going to raffle off based on your tickets. It's going to be a really fun night. We're going to watch the game, and then we're going to record a live show with the people there at the restaurant. So it's going to be really fun. But Shane, before we close things out, tell everybody where they can find your work.
Our radio shows on Sirius XM NHL Network Radio, Channel 91. We're on Saturdays and Sunday mornings. But if you miss it or you don't have Sirius XM, that's okay. You can get it on any podcast format, Hockey Prospect Radio, or as well, if you're into YouTube as well, we have a YouTube channel as well, so you can watch some past episodes as well. So this is our 18th season, so we're plugging along, and hopefully for a few more years.
Absolutely fantastic. Thanks so much, everybody, for watching. I know it's tough to be engaged in the second straight bad season, but hey, there's probably a couple more on the rise, so buckle in. We'll enjoy it together. Can't wait to see so many of your faces on Saturday. We'll see you then.
Game over! Powered by Sports Interaction.